We've already talked a little bit about measuring wealth and class positions, and now we're going to talk a little bit about measuring poverty, because there are very similar questions about how we do this. Okay, so for a really long time, like up until 2018, Canada had no such thing as a poverty line. Instead, what we had was this low income cutoff score, the LICO score, and that was a measurement of how much of your income you were spending on necessities. So, food, clothing, shelter, basically, in that sort of space. And if you were spending more than 30% of your income on those things, you were considered to be low income. Um, and that sort of system is actually really useful. One of the reasons that Canada can't sort of say, well, if you are earning less than X dollars, you are living in poverty, is because regional variations are quite significant. So there's lots of examples of that. In another video, we sort of talked about housing prices, right? Like if you live in an environment where the average house price is $1 million, then an income of $40,000 a year does not have the same purchasing power and you're not going to have the same experience of life than if you're living in a community where the average price of a home is only, say, $200,000 a year, just because your income is closer to what would allow you to afford that. There's all of those sorts of pieces in terms of whether you can save and how much discretionary spending you have, because aside from anything else, the average price of a house is likely to impact what rents are charged. All of those things are related. So one of the challenges with measuring poverty in Canada is that regional variation. Canada's a really big country, and rural Alberta and downtown Vancouver are not the same, right? Even downtown Edmonton, not the same in terms of how much anything costs. Um, and that's sort of an important conversation to have, that's still identified in Canada's current poverty sort of measurement, which we refer to as the market basket measure. And that is a little bit different, in that it's essentially a marker of, we make a list of goods, right? And we talk about what those goods might be. So when we talk about a market basket measure, we might talk about, okay, you need to be able to afford shelter and food and clothing. Importantly, the market basket measure adds transportation. We could have some really interesting conversations about what that means. We might talk about sort of things like whether or not you need access to entertainment, whether or not you need access to the internet. And we have all of these discussions and we make a decision about a basic standard of living. Okay? And whether or not, like, what all that includes. And then we talk about whether or not you are making enough income to afford that set of goods in the environment that you're living in, right? So again, this is a way of accounting for regional variation, to sort of talk about, well, what counts as low income in Toronto, for example, which is a relatively large, relatively expensive city to live in, might not qualify as low income in, say, Charlottetown or in Hamilton or even like in Red Deer. Okay, just because a lot of those expenses are going to be a little bit different, and what it costs to purchase many of those goods will vary. Okay, so that's a market basket measure. We don't talk about it much. Like, this is something that's really new in Canada. Like, we don't talk about it until 2018. So we're into year 3, and 2 of those were pandemic years. So we'll see how that works out. Um, and one of the things that I sort of want to highlight in that is that this is really obvious when it comes to things like rent, but we have way more questions about what transportation and what food might look like when we look across regions. So, as much as we might complain about it and find challenges with using it, Edmonton, for example, has a public transit system, right? There is public transit in Edmonton. Great. What do you do in a community like, and that means, for example, that when we're measuring sort of market basket goods, often when we sort of talk about access to transportation, what we're talking about is access to a bus pass. Okay, great. But what do we do in small communities where there is no public transit? because that means you kind of need a car. And what standard do we have to put the car at? And one of the things that I want you to understand about this sort of market basket measure is that it really fundamentally, again, systems of social stratification are what we're primarily interested in sociology. One of the things that is absolutely essential to understand about something like a market basket measure is that it fundamentally rests on discussions and decisions about what is basic or essential in a standard of living that is sort of dignified in the society that you're in. I've had many students who work in social service industries, who work as sort of care workers and as social workers, as providing sort of support to people who are living in homeless shelters. And they often highlight things like, okay, but our market basket measures don't usually include, for example, you need to be able to afford a smartphone and you need to be able to afford a data plan. And there are a lot of people who will treat that as, well, that's because that's a luxury and not essential. And I've had students come back from that perspective and look at me and say, yeah, except for think about all of the places that are going to schedule you for an interview based on an online application and expect to email you back with times for an interview or anything like that. What about the places that are only going to email you your work schedule, right? Or that you're expected to check some online portal to figure that out? That means that you can't actually participate in the workforce meaningfully without access to the internet. And that in a lot of contexts, right, like it's not reasonable to say, well, you have to go to the library and get access to the internet while everyone else sort of does that from home, because it adds these sort of additional constraints, right? Do we talk about childcare as sort of a necessary market, like as a necessary aspect of sort of family life? And for who, right? If both parents are working, maybe you need childcare, but what about like at what point do we expect one parent to stay home? And is that a fair expectation? And how does that play into our ideas about poverty? If both parents are and if both parents are staying home, right? Like if you have one parent staying at home, does it make sense to count childcare there as an expense as well? Okay, so these are really highly politicized and sort of negotiable questions.